Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Chinese President Xi Jinping, in a meeting with the chairman of the Boao Forum for Asia, BanKi-moon, stressed the importance of globalization. How can China encourage others as well to maintain multilateralism? Turkey and Israel have expelled each other's ambassadors after Israeli forces killed 60 Palestinian protesters and injured a few hundred. Can the U.S. mend the relationship between its key Middle Eastern allies? Let's begin our program today with China's economy. Nowadays, economic globalization has become an irreversible trend, and many believe that in the world, while instability and uncertainty also linger on. The whole world is facing new problems and challenges, according to Chinese President Xi Jinping. China's opening up policy is gaining traction as it promotes world economic development with mutually beneficial solutions. Can this be the way forward for the rest of the world as well? Before we ask our panel, take a look at this.
The economic winds of change. On Tuesday, Chinese President Xi Jinping met the newly elected chairman of the Boao Forum for Asia, BanKi-moon. During the meeting, President Xi said China firmly supports multilateralism, maintaining the global trading system and building an open world economy. President Xi has promised to further open up China to the world at last month's Boao Forum. Opening up has enabled China to sustain 40 years of high-speed growth. Moreover, China is establishing the Xiong'an New Area and Hainan Free Trade Zone to advance free trade. China is also pushing for multilateral trade talks and including more countries in its Belt and Road Initiative. China's Ministry of Commerce held a press briefing Thursday on consumption and service trade. According to the spokesperson, during the past 4 months, 19,002 new foreign investment enterprises were founded, with year-on-year growth of 95.4%, of which $43.6 billion had actually been used, and the outbound direct investment reached $35.6 billion, with year-on-year growth of 34.9%.
China is working on upgrading its industrial structure, and Chinese people want a better life and better quality. So China would like to work with other countries, including the U.S., to expand imports and also welcome companies from around the world, including the U.S., to do business in China.
The momentum of positive, stable economic development has been maintained in China, and steps China is taking are in favor of its trading partners, which help build a wealthier shared future for all mankind.
For more discussion about China's further opening up and where the world is going, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Mr. Wang Huiyao, who is a counselor of the State Council. Welcome, sir, to be with us here in Beijing. He is the head of the Center for China and Globalization. In Hong Kong, we are joined by Professor Xiao Geng, Professor of Finance and Public Policy at Hong Kong University, well-known Chinese economist there. Thank you so much, sir. And in Frankfurt, we have Adam Posen. It's good to have you here, Mr. Posen. Good to see you again, President of the Peterson Institute based in the United States. Let me begin by reading to all of you, gentlemen, a quote coming from Chinese President Xi Jinping recently during a meeting with BanKi-moon, who is now the chairman of the Boao Forum for Asia. He said this: as unstable and uncertainty factors are increasing and new problems and challenging things are emerging, Asian countries and the international community need to make the right choices between 1, opening up or isolation, innovation or conservatism, win-win results or zero-sum games. That's the question that Chinese President Xi Jinping posed to his guest and also, I guess, to the rest of the world. Mr. Posen, from your perspective, how to answer those questions? Those are tough questions, isn't it, today?
I think the issue is, as President Xi has said, maintaining a China that opens up and reforms and is consistent with the rules-based system in the world. That's in China's own interest. It's also in the U.S.'s interest if it sees it properly. There are issues to be debated, and the world system has to adapt to new technologies. Most of all, the world system has to adapt to China staying not a market system, but a socialist country with Chinese characteristics. That requires negotiation, but it is not grounds for conflict.
Words are words. Terminologies are terminologies. But I guess the real essence of this debate is where we are going from here. I'm also very happy to be joined in Washington, D.C., inside the U.S., David Dollar, Senior Fellow with the Foreign Policy and Global Economy and Development Programs with the Brookings Institution. Mr. Dollar, used to see you in Beijing a lot, and it's good to have you in Washington now. What do you make of that, the choices that we seem to have to make on a daily basis now?
Well, I think this is really a crucial moment. You know, China has benefited a lot from partially opening up its economy,
the issues
particularly
going
some of the
ahead
manufacturing
are
sectors.
things that should be able to be resolved.
But China has,
sorry, this is to Mr.
still
Dollar.
has quite a bit of protection, particularly in service sectors. So President Xi Jinping has indicated China is going to open up the economy more. I think the world is really looking forward to China following through on that. Meanwhile, the U.S. is really going backwards, imposing various types of protection. So I think the world is looking at the U.S. to move away from that and stay open, and looking to China to become more open.
This is not just the world between China and the United States, Mr. Wang. This is also a very diversified discussion and debate. If you look at what is going on between the EU and the U.S. right now about the Boeing and Airbus debate, if you look at the NAFTA situation, which is still being debated right now, the negotiation is going on in Mexico City. If you look at the CPTPP compared to earlier version of TPP, if you look at the U.S. and China trade discussions right now in Washington, D.C., these are not just sporadic cases. These are cases that are happening at the same time that really say something about our days these days. Mr. Wang, your thought?
Well, I think the first generation of the globalization after Bretton Woods system, which is United Nations, WTO, World Bank, and all the rest, actually after going, operating for the last 70 years, needs to be upgraded, needs to be sustained, needs to be improved. And China wants to add on. I think China has been really active, embracing globalization in the last 20 years or even 40 years. But I think now the conflict, the system of the 20th century, or maybe the trading system, or trading rules of 20th century, needs to adapt it to the 21st century. So I think when we adapt to the 21st century, we need China to participate. We need a new system, I think more consultation, but also new thinking as well. We cannot go back to the traditional goods movement thinking only. Probably we should include the service, we should include the investment, tourism, all aspects of that. So just by focusing on the goods movement alone, without talking about value chain, without talking about all the rest, I think that leads easily to conflict. So we have to really examine this from both fronts, the methodology, the statistics, but also the new thinking in the 21st century, and also new globalization that we need to add on.
Those are big and wonderful words, I have to say, Mr. Wang. But then, Professor Xiao, what kinds of new thinking, what kinds of new structures can we really work on these days, particularly given the intense debate and the trade disputes that's going on around the world? Professor Xiao.
Well, I think the key is really structure change, for every country, because the globalization, leads also, in addition to efficiency, productivity, but also inequality and a lot of domestic problems. And that is really something which each country are trying to deal with. And as a result, this leads to a lot of conflicts among the countries. But these conflicts, my view is that they will continue to exist. But the globalization is a very powerful force which will lead to innovation, productivity gain, and more linked world. So I think together, if we cooperate, we can actually solve a lot of domestic structural problems, every country has today.
But Mr. Poulsen, if I could ask you about that, I mean, we all know very well that countries have problems and challenges doing their own structural reforms. That's why they seem to have the tendency of blaming the others, because that's easier. And that's, politically speaking, with less collateral damage. But the thing is, if structural reform is not being done, they cannot depend on blaming the others all the time. And the future of the economy as a whole is going to be a big problem. So, Mr. Poulsen, at this moment, how can we weigh this so-called political calculation vis-a-vis the real benefits of structural reform? What really does it take, Mr. Poulsen, from your perspective? I know you've been doing research about this for quite some time, Mr. Poulsen.
I think talking about the political calculation is not very helpful because the Trump administration and President Trump clearly are not consistent. Whether that's because they've decided as a tactic that they wish to be what's called the madman theory and keep trying to bust things up just like they're trying to do with Iran and see what happens, or whether it's because they are genuinely inconsistent. We just have to, all of us, American business, international people, leaders in China, just have to keep talking sense. And if the politics goes awry, then one has to retaliate against bad policies in the legal means and hope the American government wakes up.
This is not just about the United States, is it? I mean, Mr. Wang, from your perspective, I mean, China now, as China itself has said, coming into a new era. There are different characteristics of this new era, but one of the things that's important is the emerging economies are really becoming much more influential than it used to be. But the question is whether it is also taking the leadership in thinking about how future trade, how future economy is going to be interacting with one another so that more benefits can be shared. That probably is even more important than just the amount of the economy or the size of the economy itself. Mr. Wang.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely right. I think right now, because China is at this moment of critical moment of reflecting 40 years anniversary of opening up. So it's a time to think back and also think through and think forward. I think that China has to realize that after all, after China joined WTO, China's GDP almost gone up 10 times. China really got developed in the last 20 years and also 40 years. So I think so the consensus now in the Chinese leadership is that, of course, opening up, of course, reform. But as to what degree, should we just follow WTO? But maybe we should look forward. Maybe we should even consider TPP. We should have more advanced trading system or rule-based arrangement in regional and global development. Maybe we should consider set up a new global trading platform like internet, like cyberspace, and even talent flows and things like that. Service tourism, e-commerce, which is China is very developed and the U.S. is very developed. But this area hasn't really been international protocol to look at the e-commerce. Online shopping, Chinese buyers one day can buy almost 20 billion.
Right.
So that can be transferred, diverted to the U.S. so that we can address some of those new balance issues. But using the new technology and new thinking of that, rather than just focus on the old calculation of the goods going through your customer. But the value chain has really changed that. A lot of goods going through China was not necessarily gained by China.
Mr. Dollar, you know better than many others that there has to be a change of thinking because we are really coming into an age in which technologies is really transforming borders. And also, there are a lot of things going on that we did not see when WTO was established. We did not see when WTO has welcomed China about 30 years ago, so 20 years ago. So there are a lot of things happening right now that we haven't seen. How will the system improve? How should the system improve, Mr. Dollar?
All right. So I think Mr. Wang makes some very important points about changes in the world, the development of e-commerce, the expansion of global value chains. We've reached a point where Most of the value added in global trade comes from service sectors, not from manufacturing. So there are all these important changes. We really need to update the global system, and it depends primarily on China, the United States, the European Union. There are other important players, but these three big economies, they really need to work together to update the rules of the World Trade Organization. And then we don't really have global investment rules. Investment has also become quite critical. It's very hard to imagine trade today without investment. So we need to update the rules, and right now we don't have a good mechanism for that. The U.S. and China were negotiating a bilateral investment treaty, but that seems that that's been pushed aside by the Trump administration. The U.S. pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I think it's a dangerous moment right now where we're not updating the institutions of the international economy, but the world has changed and we really need to.
But Professor Xiaogang, we cannot be just dragged down by one negotiation, which is still going on right now. No one is expecting to have any immediate result at any moment. But the thing is, there are things that you have to do parallel. While you are having bilateral discussions, there are things that also has to be done about how to improve the systems as a whole. And China needs to think about that. Professor Xiao, have you been reading some signs coming from different parties about that?
Well, I think the negotiations is just one thing. China has its own, thinking about the opening and the reform, and those are pretty much consistent with what the other parties are expecting. So
Explain,
I think,
Explain, please, Professor Xiao, if you can.
For example,
many of those who are not following
the financial
all the
reform.
latest. Go ahead.
Yeah, for example, the financial opening is necessary because the financial sectors are not very efficient in China. By opening up, that will help China to improve the efficiency of its economy. And also the service sector needs to be opened up because China's manufacturing is pretty open, pretty competitive, but in the service sector really lagging behind. And the only way to improve is to opening up. So I think China now is actually at a pretty good stage because after a few years of consolidation, and it is about the time to open up in financial sector, in service sector, and also to improve a lot of governance because Chinese governance systems has been evolved a long way from the old system. But still, it's pretty far away from best practice. So I think anyway, it's time for China to do something to set the example, no matter what others will do.
China itself needs on its way to improve its own economy and that of the rest of the world, no matter what others are trying to do. That's an interesting quote from you. But let me also go to Mr. Poulsen, if you could hear me well, Mr. Poulsen. How do you see the internal debate and the external debate regarding China, about China, taking place all at the same time? How is this having an impact on China's visions and actions so far, your reading?
I think China's actions, like any other country, like Mexico, like Germany, are having to do a lot of self-examination since they're not able to rely on a stable U.S. at the moment. China's reactions going forward have to be guided by its own self-interest, but as your previous guest just said, there's a huge economic interest for China to open up its services market. There are reasons to limit certain kinds of financial sector opening, but non-financial services and non-financial goods could benefit from greater opening. Cross-border investment is potentially the most fruitful way of doing this, but there are genuine suspicions on both sides of the Pacific. U.S. about the intentions of Chinese acquisitions, China about not letting U.S. or other foreign firms have sole ownership. That's where the issue is going to have to come in practice in coming years.
But Mr. Wang, if others, or some specific others, begin to close doors, what should China do?
Well, I think China should continue to open because it's become already a national policy. China has actually also launched the BRI initiative, which I think should get more international collaboration. And
Belt and Road Initiative, yeah. That's what you refer to.
Yeah, and participation, and you know, we should have an international shareholding system of the BRI system, and maybe international committee on that as well. So I think the Chinese are really good now, at least, I mean, the government is sold on opening up. But as to how to really implement that, I think we need a more international collaboration, and there's quite a few things we could do. For example, we should not having this China company or foreign company concept in China. All the companies registered in China are Chinese companies, should be treated equally. And that's some of the, and one also that we should welcome foreign investment and have a you know, in the old days, like for worry about when WTO was opened, all the auto industry were going to be wiped out. At that time, there was only one model to choose in Santana for 20 years. Now you have so many choices. So those are things I think the open you will really help to diversify, to leave the people, you know, improve their lives. Also, China should lower the tariff as well.
Right. There are a lot of talk about China should, and China should, and China should, and China should. But Mr. Dollar, if I could go to you, and if I could also see other three gentlemen as well on our screen, that is how to see the implementation of these shoulds to real actions. No matter what the external environment is, that would be very challenging for any country, I would say, particularly if you have protectionism on the rise in some parts of the world.
Right. I agree with your sentiment, Tianwei. I think that, as Mr. Wang said, I think unilateral liberalization is in China's interest, but it's very hard to do that politically. You have interest groups that have grown up behind protected walls that are going to resist. And that's why negotiated multilateral openness is often the best approach. Basically, if Chinese people, different interest groups, if they see that China is getting something in terms of changes in U.S. policy or European policy, it's easier then to expect Chinese interest groups to accept a more open trade and investment environment. So that's why I think negotiation is important. And if you've got rising protectionism in the U.S., if you've got things like Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, the market there, basically, you know, that is really creating a very bad environment in which China can continue to open up.
Before we go, I would like to invite every one of you, gentlemen, you are thinkers in world economics and trade, one sentence, if you can, about what will be the sign that you are reading now, which is helping us to understand where global trade is going. So let me begin with Professor Xiao. One sentence, if you can, right now, sir.
Well, I think globalization will continue, you know, although we're going to have a lot of bumpers ahead.
Well, they always say so. Mr. Wang Huiyao.
Yeah, I think now we have experienced 70 years of globalization 1.0. Now we need to really start in the thinking of globalization 2.0, which I think China, US, and EU should really work together, and including Japan, to solve that. And TPP could be also a good solution that China should consider about that as well.
Wow, a lot of daring thoughts over there. Mr. Poulsen.
I'm not sure there's any quick solution. I think we're going to have to go through a period of learning how much each needs the other before we can get anywhere in terms of constructive solutions.
I see. Pragmatism in the air, it sounds like, from you, Mr. Poulsen. Last but not least, Mr. Dollar.
So I think in the short run, we have to resist this protectionist tendency that we see, particularly in the advanced economies. And in the long run, I agree with Mr. Wang. You really need European Union, United States, Japan, China, the four big economies. They have to cooperate on creating new rules for a new reality.
I want to thank the four of you, gentlemen. All of you are very sincere in your thoughts and your insights shared with all of us. Xiao Gang, Adam Poulsen, David Dollar, and Wang Huiyao. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tianwei, still to come on our program today. Turkey and Israel have expelled each other's ambassadors after Israeli forces killed 60 Palestinian protesters. Has Trump understood the repercussions of moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem? You are watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's turn to Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel has launched an overnight air raid on Hamas base in the northern Gaza Strip. The raid follows Wednesday's exchange of fire. The embassy move prompted Palestinian leaders to turn their backs on the U.S. and ignited a wave of violence that has international leaders weighing in. Will full-scale war break out at any moment as a result of this? Before our discussion, take a look at this backgrounder.
More violence and a rising death toll. The protests continue after Israeli forces killed at least 60 Palestinians and injured thousands. The bloodiest clashes in years have created a diplomatic crisis. The Palestinian Authority has withdrawn its envoy from Washington.
What would your countries do? Would they accept that the Security Council remain paralyzed, doing nothing in the face of these crimes and massacres, which are organized by the cowardly Israeli Occupation Authority, which is hiding in the hills some 1 kilometer away from the civilians in Gaza?
First, they incite people to violence. Then they place as many civilians as possible, including women and children, in the line of fire to maximize civilian casualties. Then they blame Israel, and then they come here to complain to the UN.
And Turkey and Israel expelled each other's ambassadors. Turkish president described the actions of the Israeli forces as genocide and accused the UN of not playing its due role.
In the face of all these events, the United Nations has ended. It has become exhausted and collapsed because the United Nations exists to have justice prevail.
The relocation of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is so controversial because the status of Jerusalem is at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The city is significant to Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, the 3 major Abrahamic religions. It's built over the site where Christians believe Jesus Christ was crucified and rose from the dead. And it owns Judaism's holiest site, the Western Wall. Muslims believe the city is where their prophet ascended into heaven 14 centuries ago. The shared heritage of the city sometimes sparked tensions between the 3 monotheistic faiths. The dispute marks the worst diplomatic crisis between regional powers Israel and Turkey since Israeli Marines stormed an aid ship to enforce a naval blockade of Gaza in 2010. Many international organizations are calling on all sides to de-escalate the situation.
For more discussion on Israeli-Palestinian tensions, we are joining our Beijing studio He Wenping, professor at the West Africa and Asia Studies in the Institute of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, ma'am. In Ankara, we have Selçuk Çolakoglu, who is the director of the Turkish Center for Asia-Pacific Studies and professor of international relations. In Washington, D.C., the U.S., we have Dr. Bülent Ali Reza, who is the director and senior associate of the Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to all of you. A lot of things going on right now in the greater Middle East as a result of the moving of the embassy from the U.S. To Jerusalem. Let me ask you, Dr. Ali Reza, about the fact that so many things happening at the same time. Many really wondered, is this going to be the beginning of a long-time escalated conflict?
The short answer is no. The world, including the Arab world and the Islamic world, has unfortunately come to terms with the fact that there's going to be sporadic violence between Israel and the Palestinians. The Arab countries that previously fought Israel in the past, Egypt and Jordan, are at peace with Israel. They have formal peace treaties. Syria is in a state of civil war. The other countries beyond the immediate region, like Saudi Arabia, are more concerned about Iran. So even though what happened is tragic, there's not going to be a war, and it's more likely that there's going to be the kind of conflagration that we should be concerned about involving Israel and Iran because of the Iranian presence in Syria.
Mr. Çakmakoglu, what about your judgment? Has the landscape over there, when it comes to security and the relations among all players, been fundamentally changed as a result of the factor of Iran?
Of course, the decision of the removal of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem by the United States is the main cause of today's events. But also the Israeli security forces heavy handling of the protests in Gaza Strip is another cause. But at the end, this is an expected escalation in the region, and also there was also concern in recent weeks for further escalation for the embassy, because of the embassy move and because of the anniversary of the foundation of Israel, and also anniversary of the Palestinian migration from Israeli territory. But now the current situation is much more higher than the expectation, but we can still say that there is no expectation a so-called war or more large-scale clashes in that sense. So this is somewhat usual business in the Middle East and Israeli-Palestinian issue, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you said, sir. But, you know, are we going to see, Ms. He, the nature of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, particularly its impact on the greater Middle East, be diminishing rather than increasing if you look at the overall picture of the greater Middle East? Ms. He.
Yeah, I think that's for sure. Actually, this Palestine-Israel conflict used to be a center of all those conflicts in the Middle East. But through for the past years, this issue has been marginalized. And because all other issues like Syria civil war, like anti-ISIL, all of this has becoming, increasingly important. Plus, recent years, we have seen that Iran nuclear competition with Saudi, and also like Saudi's, closer with Israel, now becoming another main issue in the whole picture. So that's why this marginalized issue, Palestine-Israel conflict, and then because it's marginalized, so that doesn't matter. So that's why I think one of the factors can push President Trump to make this very bold decision, because it's already been marginalized. So doesn't matter if I move another way forward. It's not going to be a agree with those colleagues there. So not going to be a war, but its tensions will be building up.
Tension will be building up, and lives will be lost. And unfortunately, not many people are really working on that anymore to change the picture. Therefore, may I ask you, Dr. Ali Reza in Washington, D.C., what exactly, if you think the previous logic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of the centerpiece of all the involvement of relations in the Middle East has been changed, then what exactly is it now? What exactly is the nature? Can we pin down it? Dr. Ali Reza.
Well, it's easy to pin down, but very difficult to come up with a prescription to actually get out of the current impasse. The reality is that there is a confrontation between Israel and the Palestinians, but it's worth noting that it's mostly on the Israeli-Gaza border. There are Palestinians living in the West Bank, which is under Israeli occupation, but there have been no major demonstrations in there, and none in Jerusalem, which is at the very center of the crisis. Look, the Trump administration, Trump himself, has been talking about a peace deal that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is in charge of. But the likelihood of any movement towards an Israeli-Palestinian deal is, frankly, slimmer than it's ever been. I think the world has learned to live with this crisis. I agree with the consensus that other issues are much more urgent, including Korea, that we did not mention at the global level. That wasn't the case before. We've had a number of wars in the past because of the Palestinian issue. The reality is that the Palestinian issue is going to continue as an irritant, but not as a major crisis, unfortunately.
But then how shall we see that, Mr. Çalhakoglu, about the nature, the centerpiece of how the logic of the Middle East has been evolving? If there are any solutions that have to be carved out, we better find out what is the centerpiece. To you, what exactly is it? Is it still in the time of transition, Mr. Çalhakoglu?
When we got the Israeli-Palestinian issue, of course, it's very deep-rooted and sometimes frozen, but sometimes hot dispute in the region. But it is also the expectation of solution is almost done under the framework of the Oslo peace process. But in current atmosphere, despite the rising tension in the region and other things, there may be a chance for further negotiations. Particularly the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia now are focusing on focusing on Iran and Iranian expansion influence in Syria and Lebanon. So then the primary agenda of those three countries are Israel right now. So this common ground will give a chance to peace negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians, at least to de-escalate of tension and also to get more support for this push against Iran from the Arab countries. So then the region is full of surprise. So then starting a new fresh negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians will be another one if there is.
But Ms. He, if I could ask that question, I hope I'm not being so-called innocent and naive when I ask that question. What you have explained, all of you, it's not fair, some would believe, to the Palestinians, because they are still suffering as much as they did before, probably even more, because what they consider as unfair, the moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem by the United States. And the overall focus of the Middle East has been evolving. Then, are we seeing a fairer picture in the Middle East, or things are getting ever more, in a way, going to the negative direction? Ms. He.
Well, unfortunately, even though the Palestinian people now suffering more and more, but I'm not so optimistic to see any other solution coming up to rescue the people, even living in the Gaza Strip or in the in the Palestinian side. So because there's no authority, no strong backup for Palestinian side. Now, before we are talking about Egypt, this very influential Middle East country, but now they're also closer with Saudi. And also now the Saudi and even with Israel, they are also working together to counter, with the Iran. So all those pictures now is not a favor with Palestinian side. Even though Palestinian side can go to international stage, calling for those sympathy, and also go to other international organizations to becoming a member, in the UNESCO. But all of that is just a diplomatic front.
Right.
Those wins. But in the real ground, in the Middle East area, this Jerusalem issue, but they have no bargaining chips in their hand.
Okay. Dr. Ali Reza, you are living in Washington. You know very well, through different generations of American presidents, whoever is able to do something about the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians is likely to be carved the name onto a monument. But now, I guess things will change. So what would this issue mean to the agenda of an American president, whether it's President Trump, who is quite an outlier, as they say, among all the other presidents, or future presidents to come about this? Dr. Ali Reza.
Well, if we look back, we see Carter making a major effort on this issue and getting Sadat and Begin together. Clinton tried very hard. Obama tried very hard. But by the end of his term, it's significant that Obama had pretty much given up on the idea of Middle East peace. As I said, Trump talks about a peace deal that is achievable, but I don't think that's his focus. He realizes that this is not going to happen. He's drawn closer to Israel, frankly, than any American president. He's done by moving the embassy to Jerusalem what previous presidents promised before they were elected, but never did. When we look at the team that he's put together, dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Kushner, the ambassador who's just moved to Jerusalem, Friedman, and Greenblatt, who's the negotiator. These are all very close to Netanyahu and the Israeli establishment, and the Palestinians have very little confidence in them. So I just don't think that this particular American president, this particular administration, is going to take any major steps towards a settlement, and they're going to focus on other aspects of the overall Middle Eastern equation, namely Iran.
Okay. Before we go, 30 seconds left for also Mr. Çalhakoglu. What would you say, sir, this mean for the other countries, U.S. attitude now, and also how the major conflict in the Middle East has been evolving? What would that mean for the other major powers in the region? Very briefly from you.
When we regard the Palestinian issue or Palestinian declaration of statehood in general, the United States is the only country have a pressure or power capacity over Israel. So without strong American involvement, finding a solution for the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the declaration of the Palestinian state is very difficult. And also interestingly, the other regional countries like Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia have no strong leverages on that to force Israel to get some action to the settlement of the Palestinian issue. And very interesting also, Russia has a more neutral position when we look at the Israeli-Iran rift over Syria. So it is very difficult that without American involvement, there is a strong involvement, there will be a settlement and further progress for Middle East issues in general.
We are running out of time. Thank you so much, He Wenping, Çalhakoglu, and also Dr. Bülent Ali Reza. Thank you so much for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN in your search engine, or find us on social media platforms. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thank you so much for being with us, and see you next time.